April 16, 1945. At dawn, the horizon east of Berlin trembled beneath a roar, unlike anything Europe had yet endured. Over 1 million Soviet soldiers, backed by thousands of tanks and artillery pieces, unleashed the final offensive of the war. The ground quaked, windows shattered, and the very air vibrated as shells screamed overhead. Inside the capital, in damp bunkers and makeshift field hospitals, young German women braced for a storm that would not end until the city itself lay in ruins. They were barely older than schoolgirls, many still teenagers, swallowed by oversized uniforms. Some clutched rifles they had never expected to fire. Others scrambled to man anti-aircraft batteries, their hands trembling as they loaded shells into weapons taller than themselves. Beneath the Reich chancellery and in hospital basements, nurses leaned over stretchers, already filling with casualties from the front lines. Hitler had always declared that women belonged in kitchens, nurseries, and schools, yet desperation had torn down his own ideology. The Reich, bleeding from all sides, had no choice but to place its daughters at the front. In one bunker near the Alexanderplatz, a 19-year-old nurse whispered to her friend as bombs shook dust from the ceiling, "If this is the end, I want to die quickly." Her companion answered only with silence, eyes fixed on the flickering light of a candle. Outside, the shriek of Katyusha rockets tore through the night, the dreaded Stalin's organ, heralding the Soviet advance. Berlin had become a city suspended between defiance and doom. Propaganda posters still plastered the walls, urging victory or death. But everyone knew the truth. The Reich was collapsing. Amid the rubble-strewn streets, women formed an invisible front line. Flakhelferinnen, female flak auxiliaries, gripped binoculars and scanned the skies for Soviet aircraft. In air raid shelters, Red Cross nurses prepared bandages that would be soaked through within hours. Some carried pistols, others carried morphine, all carried fear. The paradox was undeniable. Hitler, who had once mocked the Soviets for sending women to war, now relied on his own. Their faces, pale and sleepless, reflected both terror and determination. They were not soldiers by choice, but by circumstance, drawn into the machinery of war that cared nothing for gender, only for survival. As the thunder of artillery grew closer, the women's roles became blurred. A nurse who had spent months stitching wounds now found herself hauling ammunition to the front line. A girl who had once kept records in an office now crouched behind sandbags, her finger hovering over a trigger. Diaries captured the transformation. One entry read, "They told us we were to defend the fatherland, but tonight, it feels as though we are defending only each other." Smoke rose over Berlin like a funeral shroud, blackening the sky and choking the air. Civilians huddled in cellars, listening to the shriek of shells and the distant rumble of tanks. In the corridors of hospitals, wounded soldiers begged for water, for morphine, for their mothers. The nurses moved between them in silence, faces set, hands cracked from washing with cold water and scraps of soap. Their uniforms, once symbols of order and discipline, were now stained with blood and ash. On that first day of the Soviet offensive, the women of Berlin witnessed what it meant to fight in the Reich's last stand. They saw the contradiction of their own existence, called heroines in propaganda, but treated as expendable in reality. Hitler had sought to confine them to the role of mothers, yet his empire now demanded they become fighters, healers, and martyrs in its dying breath. The chapter closes with an image etched into memory. A young woman, no more than 17, standing on the roof of a flak tower as the sun sets through smoke. Her helmet slips forward on her head, too large for her frame. She lifts her eyes to the horizon where the Soviet artillery fire paints the sky red. With trembling hands, she pushes another shell into the breech of the gun, knowing each round may be her last act of defiance. Berlin's final battle had begun, and women, once relegated to silence, now stood at the heart of it. Before the firestorm of 1945, German women had been kept carefully at the margins of the battlefield. The Nazi state exalted them as mothers, homemakers, and bearers of the Reich's future, not fighters. Their place, Hitler insisted, was in the nursery and the kitchen, while men carried rifles and shed blood. Yet war, relentless in its appetite, had no patience for ideology. By 1942, losses on the Eastern Front had begun to drain Germany of its youth. Whole divisions vanished in the snows of Stalingrad, and fresh conscripts were swallowed daily in the carnage of Kursk and beyond. As graves filled, the Reich was forced to look inward, to its schools, its factories, and eventually to its daughters. Women already served in the Reich labor service, ready, where they worked in farms and munitions plants, or as auxiliaries in the Luftwaffe, tapping out signals in cramped rooms and keeping ledgers filled with casualty lists. But these tasks, once deemed sufficient, no longer stemmed the tide of defeat. The Reichstag echoed with debates cloaked in propaganda. Officials clung to the fiction that women could remain sheltered. Yet by 1943, the demands of total war shattered those illusions. Schools closed as classrooms emptied into barracks. Teenage girls, some barely 15, traded books for binoculars and were drilled in the mechanics of flak guns. They were assigned to the Flakhelferinnen program, the female flak helpers, whose task was to scan the skies, track Allied bombers, and feed shells into anti-aircraft batteries that shook the earth with every volley. Diaries and testimonies reveal the dissonance of their new reality. A girl from Hamburg recorded, "In the morning, I trained with the rifle. In the evening, I was told to darn socks for the troops. They wanted us to be soldiers and housewives in the same breath." Another wrote with quiet bitterness, "They called us heroines on posters, but we were only children too afraid to speak." Propaganda wrapped this mobilization in noble colors. Posters showed smiling young women in neat uniforms, their eyes lifted toward the skies, captions urging them to defend the fatherland. Newsreels framed them as symbols of loyalty, guardians of Germany's skies. In truth, they stood trembling on flak towers, listening for the drone of bombers, their hair still braided like schoolgirls. Hitler himself resisted this transformation almost to the end. He had derided the Soviets for fielding women as snipers and pilots, sneering that Germany would never degrade its daughters in the same way. Yet, as Soviet tanks pushed across Poland and American bombers reduced German cities to ashes, his defiance bent to desperation. By 1944-45, women were no longer auxiliaries, but combatants in all but name. They relayed messages under fire, carried ammunition, dug trenches, and, in Berlin's last days, fired rifles from barricades. One striking account comes from a 17-year-old girl conscripted into a flak unit outside Essen. She remembered the contradiction vividly. "We were taught to strip rifles as if it were a game. Then we were told to write letters home as if we were still daughters. At night, the sky burned, and I knew neither daughter nor soldier described me anymore." This reluctant mobilization marked a profound collapse of Nazi ideology. The very leader who had built his Reich on rigid gender roles was now dependent on the labor, courage, and endurance of women to hold his empire together. Their transition from auxiliaries to warriors was not celebrated in the corridors of power. It was forced in the rubble of cities, in the firestorms of Hamburg, and in the choking dust of Berlin's bunkers. The paradox ran deeper than uniforms. These women were trained to obey, drilled in discipline, yet their battlefield was chaos. They were called heroines, yet stripped of choice. They stood as living contradictions, the embodiment of a regime that both exalted and exploited them, shattering their innocence while denying them recognition. By the time April 1945 dawned, the Reich's survival rested as much on these reluctant warriors as on the crumbling Wehrmacht divisions at the front. And as the guns thundered closer to Berlin, their transformation from auxiliaries to defenders revealed the desperate truth. Germany's last stand would be fought not only by its soldiers, but by its daughters. By April 1945, Berlin was no longer a capital. It was a battlefield. The Soviet artillery barrage that opened on April 20th, Hitler's 56th birthday, turned the city into a sea of rubble. Streets that once echoed with parades now roared with tanks and cracked with rifle fire. In this furnace of destruction, women bore roles their society had never imagined for them. At the edges of the city, teenage flak girls, the Flakhelferinnen, manned anti-aircraft batteries, their faces streaked with soot and fear. They had been taught to track bombers in the sky. Yet now they stared down Soviet aircraft that descended like predators. Many collapsed from exhaustion, their young bodies unable to withstand the days-long strain of continuous bombardments. A 17-year-old wrote, "My hands shook on the trigger. I could not tell if it was fear or the weight of the rifle that was heavier than me." Below ground, hospitals had been forced into cellars and subway tunnels. Nurses worked by candlelight, stitching wounds with thread scavenged from sewing kits, their fingers raw and trembling. The thunder of shells above shook plaster loose from ceilings, covering the wounded in dust. One nurse whispered prayers over a boy no older than her brother, knowing morphine had long since run out. She later recalled, "The bombs fell like rain. We counted seconds between explosions, hoping the next." As Soviet troops closed in, the illusion of a front dissolved. The battle consumed entire neighborhoods. Women were ordered into the Volkssturm, Hitler's desperate people's militia. Grandmothers, widows, and schoolgirls alike were handed rifles or Panzerfausts and told to defend street corners against Red Army tanks. The line between soldier and civilian, healer and fighter, collapsed in the choking smoke of Berlin's last stand. A housewife from Charlottenburg later described how she was pressed into service. "They gave us rifles and said, 'The fatherland is at your door.' I had never held a weapon. My hands shook so much, I feared I would shoot myself before the enemy." Others tried to cling to fragments of humanity amid the ruins. Women boiled water over open flames in bombed-out courtyards, offering tea to trembling soldiers who had nothing left to give but silence. The paradox was brutal and inescapable. These women, long held up as symbols of life and renewal, were now forced into the machinery of death. Nurses, once guardians of health, amputated limbs without anesthesia. Schoolgirls fired rifles from shattered windows at enemy soldiers they could scarcely see. The Reich had demanded mothers. Instead, it forged reluctant warriors. The Soviets pressed relentlessly forward, street by street, house by house. Berlin became a maze of barricades, where every cellar held both the dying and those trying desperately to keep them alive. In one district, a nurse remembered moving from a ward to a barricade, sewing wounds in the morning and carrying ammunition by nightfall. She wrote, "We no longer knew which uniform we wore, the apron or the armband, the rifle or the Red Cross. We were simply bodies, trying to endure." As April gave way to May, the capital became a tomb. The last defenders, men and women alike, fought not for victory, but for hours of survival. In the chaos, the voices of Berlin's women rose in unison, the stifled sob of a nurse, the whispered prayers of a mother, the cry of a teenage flak helper who had been asked to do the impossible. Their presence in the crossfire revealed a paradox that outlived the Reich itself, that in its dying breath, Germany's ideology shattered, forcing women into roles their leader had spent a decade denying them. When the guns finally fell silent, the streets of Berlin were unrecognizable, but the memory of women in uniform, trembling, defiant, exhausted, endured as testimony. They had been witnesses, participants, and victims of the final battle, carrying both rifles and bandages into a city that had become the grave of the Reich. The final days of April 1945 carried with them the sound of boots and the weight of dread. The Red Army, relentless in its advance, poured into German towns and cities. For many German women, their arrival meant not liberation, but a new ordeal. The Reich's propaganda had long warned of Bolshevik brutality, and now those whispered fears became tangible. The walls shook with the crash of Soviet tanks, and in basements where women huddled with children, silence was broken only by the pounding of fists on doors. Uniforms were both a shield and a target. Nurses stripped their Red Cross armbands, hiding them under mattresses or tearing them into scraps, terrified that they would be mistaken for combatants. Others clung to them, hoping the symbol might grant protection. A nurse in Köpenick recalled whispering to her colleague, "Hide your uniform. Tonight, it makes you a soldier." Yet even in these moments, testimonies reveal paradoxes. Some Soviet medics treated German wounded alongside their own. In one makeshift ward, a Red Army doctor carefully cleaned the burns of a German child, speaking softly, as if to remind those watching that war had not erased humanity. But these fragments of mercy were rare in a tide of fear. Women carried memories of humiliation, their testimonies written in trembling script years later. In diaries, words like shame, darkness, and screams appear again and again. Some sought survival through desperate strategies, smearing themselves with soot to appear older, hiding in cellars behind stacks of wood, or pretending to be mute to avoid attention. Others banded together, forming quiet alliances to protect one another, their solidarity a last act of defiance. The paradox lay in the same women who had once been mobilized as symbols of the Reich's strength, now facing its collapse in the most intimate way possible. They were both endangered by the uniforms they wore and empowered by the resilience those uniforms had demanded of them. Nurses who had stitched wounds by candlelight now used the same courage to shield patients from intruders. Teenagers once ordered to man-flak batteries now cowered in the ruins, their rifles discarded, their survival dependent not on training, but on silence. The Red Army's entry into Berlin was not only the clash of two armies, it was the collision of lives. Soviet soldiers scrawled their names on the walls of the Reichstag, declaring victory, while in the shadows women whispered prayers for endurance. In a ward deep beneath Alexanderplatz, a nurse described the moment a Soviet officer entered, surveyed the wounded Germans, and simply said, "All war, all the same." Then he ordered his men to leave the patients untouched. It was a fleeting moment of recognition, the humanity of enemies acknowledged amid destruction. These encounters revealed the contradictions of the Reich's final days. Terror and violence left scars that endured for generations, yet glimmers of compassion flickered even in the ruins. For German women, survival in 1945 meant navigating both extremes, enduring the weight of humiliation while grasping at moments of unexpected mercy. Their diaries did not glorify, nor did they excuse. They bore witness, recording the raw truth of fear and defiance at the edge of Germany's defeat. By the first week of May, the Reich was gone. But for those who had lived through the Red Army's advance, the war would never end on that date. It would live on in memories of cellars where children were silenced with hands over mouths, in the haunting sight of Soviet medics carrying German wounded, and in the whispered testimonies of women who carried both trauma and survival within them. Their presence in uniform, once meant to serve a dictator's vision, became instead a testimony of endurance in history's darkest hours. Beneath the shadow of swastikas and the echo of marching boots, there existed another war, one carried out not with rifles or artillery, but with whispers, hidden notes, and deliberate acts of sabotage. In the Reich's final years, even as propaganda demanded absolute loyalty, some German women quietly turned their uniforms into camouflage for resistance. Nurses who stitched wounds by day sometimes smuggled bread crusts into the hands of starving prisoners by night. In makeshift hospitals, coded messages were slipped between bandages or scribbled into the margins of patient records. One Red Cross volunteer recalled leaning over a cot and murmuring a phrase that was not a prayer, but a warning meant for a courier standing nearby. A simple exchange, cloaked in the routine of care, carried life-or-death weight. Factory workers, pressed into service at munitions plants, learned the art of defiance in silence. A misplaced bolt, a loosened screw, or machinery deliberately slowed could cripple production without raising suspicion. Under the glare of Gestapo overseers, women found ways to chip away at the Reich's arsenal, knowing discovery meant a sentence in Ravensbrück or a firing squad at dawn. A diary entry from a seamstress in Magdeburg recorded her terror and her resolve. Each day I break one shell, one part. It is small, but it is mine. The couriers, often teenage girls, bore the greatest risks. Carrying messages tucked inside their shoes, they pedaled bicycles through streets lined with SS checkpoints. Their youth was their shield, their courage, their only weapon. Some rode past posters that declared death to traitors, knowing the gallows awaited if they were searched. Yet they continued, weaving the fragile threads of communication between resistance groups, soldiers in hiding, and Allied contacts. Acts of sabotage were not coordinated campaigns, but scattered sparks, carried out by women who chose defiance over submission. Some did it for politics, others for conscience, and many simply because they could not endure watching injustice without protest. They were not generals nor strategists. They were secretaries delaying reports, cooks passing scraps of information, and typists inserting subtle errors into orders. Small deeds, yet in a regime built on control, even the smallest act of disobedience was rebellion. These women rarely received recognition. Post-war narratives often painted German women in uniforms as complicit servants of the Reich. But their hidden stories complicate the picture. Resistance was not only the work of men in underground bunkers or Allied spies parachuting into forests. It was also the quiet courage of women risking everything while appearing to obey. One testimony from a nurse in Dresden captures the paradox. I wore the swastika, but I carried bread to the prisoners. I saluted my superiors, but I prayed for their defeat. I lived as two people in one body. Her words echo the complexity of survival in a world where defiance and obedience could occupy the same breath. As the Reich collapsed, many of these acts remained buried, their perpetrators silenced by fear or forgotten in the rubble of history. Yet their legacy endures in fragments, in coded notes preserved in archives, in oral testimonies whispered decades later, and in the knowledge that even in the heart of a dictatorship, not all consented. The women who resisted were unsung, their sabotage invisible, their names absent from monuments. But their defiance, carried out in silence and at great personal risk, revealed that even within the uniforms Hitler had conscripted, there pulsed a quiet rebellion. Their actions remind us that history is never monolithic, and that courage sometimes speaks not in shouts of battle, but in whispers that survive against all odds. May 1945. The guns fell silent, but for German women in uniform, the end of the war was not liberation, it was uncertainty. The Reich had collapsed, yet the fate of those who had served it was still to be decided. Across Europe, surrender did not arrive in triumph, but in the form of enemy soldiers at the gates. In the East, Soviet troops gathered thousands of German women, flak helpers, nurses, auxiliaries, herding them into captivity. Camps in Poland and the Soviet Union became their new reality. Testimonies recall the rules of survival. barter with scraps of food, remain silent to avoid attention, or rely on sheer luck. Some women faced brutal abuse, others labored in harsh conditions, and many carried scars, physical and emotional, that never left them. In the West, the experience was markedly different. Captured by American or British forces, many women were seen less as combatants and more as victims of Hitler's collapsing system. Nurses were stripped of their Reich uniforms and handed aprons, absorbed quietly into Allied-run hospitals where their skills were desperately needed. A young nurse later wrote, "One day I was an enemy. The next, I was cleaning wounds for American boys. I was the same woman. Only the flag above me had changed." Relief mingled with humiliation. For some, Allied captivity meant safety from the chaos of the streets. For others, it meant carrying the burden of suspicion. Wearing a uniform, any uniform, marked them with a stigma that followed long after the camps and hospitals closed. Neighbors questioned loyalties, employers hesitated, and post-war Germany preferred silence over recognition. These women became invisible in the nation's attempt to rebuild, their stories tucked away behind walls of shame and survival. Yet even within captivity, paradoxes emerged. In American-controlled hospitals, former Luftwaffe auxiliaries tended to the wounds of Allied prisoners with the same care they had once given German soldiers. British officers noted their efficiency and discipline, even as their pasts remained unspoken. Meanwhile, in Soviet captivity, there were rare moments of unexpected mercy. A Red Army doctor sharing medicine with a German nurse, or a guard turning away so that a prisoner could slip extra bread to a starving comrade. The collapse of the Reich left women straddling two identities: servants of a defeated regime, and survivors who had endured war's cruelty in their own right. Many returned home after captivity, only to find their cities in ruins, their families gone, and their service erased from memory. The propaganda that had once hailed them as heroines of the fatherland was silent. History had little space for nuance, and so their voices faded into whispers. But the fragments that remain, diaries, oral testimonies, faded photographs of weary young women standing behind barbed wire or scrubbing hospital floors, remind us of the human dimension of surrender. The war did not end for them in May 1945. It lived on in the silence they carried, in the stigma of uniforms they could never fully shed, and in the paradox of having fought to save lives while serving a regime built on destruction. The story of these women in captivity is not one of victory or defeat, but of survival in the aftermath of collapse. Their journey bridges the battlefield to the shadows of memory, asking a final question: when the Reich fell, who remembered them, and who chose to forget? The war ended, but for countless German women in uniform, silence became their inheritance. In post-war Germany, their service, whether coerced or volunteered, found little space in official memory. The new narratives preferred generals, treaties, and cities rising from rubble. Women who had once stood at anti-aircraft batteries, stitched wounds in basements, or carried rifles into the smoke of Berlin were left unnamed. Their traces survive only in fragments. A diary in faded ink records the trembling of hands too exhausted to reload a weapon. A torn photograph shows a teenage girl in an oversized helmet, her eyes fixed skyward as fire rained down. Oral testimonies recorded decades later speak haltingly of fear, shame, and endurance. Many never spoke at all, locking away the memories of uniforms that branded them both patriots and pariahs. The paradox lingered. The regime had exalted women as mothers, guardians of the hearth. Yet in its collapse, it thrust them into the machinery of destruction. Soldiers without recognition, nurses without medicine, auxiliaries forced into the line of fire. Their story was neither one of simple heroism nor of passive victimhood. It was both and more: courage born of desperation, complicity born of coercion, humanity pressed against the steel of ideology. One nurse recalled her last days in Berlin, bandaging a soldier's leg with trembling hands while the city outside burned. Her palms were cracked, raw from scrubbing with soap that had long since run out. She whispered, "We could save more with cleanliness than with blood." Her words capture the essence of their struggle, that in the Reich's final hours, the most powerful weapon left was not a rifle, but the fragile act of care. History often consigns these women to the margins, as footnotes to a collapsing empire. Yet their presence shaped the final chapter of the war as surely as the tanks that rolled into Berlin. They were there in the flak towers, in the rubble-strewn hospitals, in the shattered factories, carrying burdens that history rarely acknowledged. Their legacy forces us to confront a difficult truth, that war consumes not only cities and armies, but the innocence of youth, the dignity of women, and the quiet courage of those who endured without medals or monuments. The last stand of the Reich was not only Hitler's, it was theirs too, fought in silence, remembered only in whispers. And as the smoke cleared and the world moved on, the echo of their forgotten voices remained. Fragile reminders that even in the darkest hours, history is carried not just by leaders, but by the unseen hands that held the line when everything else had fallen.